you. We're so happy that you're joining us on this feast of St. Junipero, Serra. Father Moore, did I say that right? I probably butchered it.
Not too bad.
Not too bad. I've been saying Junipero for a long time, but
Junipero. Yeah.
Junipero, Serra. Yes. We're going to get started, and I wanted to lay out the event. But first since I know there's a lot of you who are new, which we're so happy about, I wanted to briefly tell you that the mission of the Benedict XVI Institute for Sacred Music and Divine Worship, we were founded by Archbishop Cordileone. Our ultimate mission is to open the door of beauty to God. And we do this through two great strategies, practical resources for more beautiful liturgy and energizing the Catholic culture of the arts. And the intersection of these two strategies is the great Mass of the Americas, composed by Frank LaRocca, a twin tribute to Our Lady of Guadalupe and Our Lady of Immaculate Conception. And so a unity Mass. And we asked James Matthew Wilson. Actually, truthfully, I don't think James will be insulted if I say, first we asked Dana Gioia if he could come to the first celebration of this Mass of the Americas. And when he couldn't, he said, get James Matthew Wilson there. And from that experience of the Mass, James let loose a song cycle, which I think had been percolating in him a long time, called The River of the Immaculate Conception. So the way this evening will work is that first we're going to talk with Archbishop Cordileone, who has emerged as, I think, the strongest and most visible defender of Saint Serra in the United States at this time. And then we will move from the saint to the poet and hear readings from The River of the Immaculate Conception and discuss James's thinking and insights into taking America's deep Catholic roots seriously, which is certainly, this is the day and the time to do that. But before we do all that, we'd certainly like to ask Archbishop Cordileone to lead us in prayer.
Great. Thank you, Maggie. And thank you all for being here. It's just a great delight to have you join us. Since it is the feast day of St. Junipero Serra, I thought there would be no better prayer than the collect for this day, which was prayed at Mass today. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. O God, who by your ineffable mercy have been pleased through the labors of your priest, Blessed Junipero Serra, to count many American peoples within your church, grant by his intercession that we may so join our hearts to you in love as to carry always and everywhere before all people the image of your only begotten Son, who lives and reigns with you in unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thank you, Archbishop. Let's just first take it simple. I said you'd emerged as a leading spokesman for St. Junipero Serra as his statues begin to be defaced and toppled by mobs all over the country, but particularly in California. Tell me what happened that caused you to step forward the way you have.
Yes, you like to say that of me, and I won't deny it, but what happened was, this was something deeply personal for me. And when the first time I saw the image of the statue falling over, I literally felt sick to my stomach. It's been very distressing as I've described it. It's a deep wound in my soul. I say I took it personally because some of you may have heard me say this before. I grew up very close to the first mission that he started in San Diego. Actually, I can tell you it's exactly 3.3 miles. I've clocked it. Those of you who think in continental terms, that's exactly 5 kilometers. So I grew up very close to that mission. I visited there from time to time growing up. I passed by it frequently because it's a mile up the street from the stadium, which when I was growing up was for both football and baseball. So I passed by it many times on the street, parallel to the street, maybe a mile or less away is an Interstate 8. It's visible passing down the interstate. So it's very present, and it's one of the great icons of San Diego, that mission. So I grew up with Junipero Serra very much in my awareness. It's still a very active parish, prominent parish in the diocese there, and it was the last place I lived. I lived in the rectory there, the parish rectory, when I was the auxiliary bishop, the last place I lived before I moved up here to the Bay Area, first to Oakland, where I was bishop for 3 years, and then moved here to San Francisco. So that's, I think, what was the catalyst for me to want to immediately defend him and try to set the record straight.
You issued a statement, which again was very strongly felt, obviously, and I think had an impact. And then you were asked to do several media shows, including EWTN. And then the Washington Post stepped forward and asked you to write about Saint Junipero Serra. And it was published just yesterday. And it's called Statues of Saint Junipero Serra Deserve to Stay. And let me just read the beginning and then ask you to answer the question that you asked in this op-ed. To the protesters who tore down his statue in Los Angeles this month, the priest, friar, and saint Junipero Serra represents, quote, hate, bigotry, and colonization, as one activist put it. Nothing would have made Serra sadder, for the real man was a profound lover of all people, and especially of the indigenous peoples he came to serve. Seen through the lens of the present, many heroes of history may seem unworthy of their pedestals, but some, such as Serra, still deserve our esteem. Who then is Junipero Serra after all? Who is he, Archbishop?
Junipero Serra is a man filled with the love of God, filled with the love of Jesus Christ and zeal for the gospel, and wanting to make heroic sacrifices so people who don't know Jesus Christ can be enriched with the love and knowledge of him, and whose cultures can be transformed by the values of the gospel. It was really a vision of creating a new Christian civilization within the culture that he found here in California.
And so those who say, so in the first place, he's the apostle of California. What did he do? Why is he called the apostle of California?
Saint Junipero Serra was the first priest to come here to begin the work of evangelization. Spanish expeditions had landed before, and actually the first Mass was celebrated by an expedition that had landed in San Diego Bay in 1604, but then they sailed on. But Serra was the first one to begin to plant the seeds of the gospel, beginning in San Diego in 1769. And then began the chain of what became the 21 missions, personally founding 9 of them, and then his successors founding the other missions. So he's the apostle of California because he's the one who began the work of evangelization here, and was the founder of the mission system, and was the head of the mission system who guided it and birthed it into what it flourished into.
He's also the first Latino American saint and the first saint of any ethnicity who was canonized by Pope Francis here on American soil. What do you think? Why do you think? And there was controversy about him even then. Why do you think Pope Francis asks us to look upon this man as a saint in spite of the controversy. What was the Pope trying to tell us?
Certainly, there has been some controversy for a long time, based on ignorance and misrepresentation of the facts of history. I can only speculate as to why Pope Francis wanted to canonize. It seems that he really did want to canonize him. Normally, 2 miracles are required, one for beatification and then another one for canonization. But Pope Francis just considered his heroic life as sort of a moral miracle. So it seems he really did want to canonize him. My speculation would be that, Pope Francis is the one who's constantly calling us to go to the margins of society, to go to those who are far off, existentially as well as geographically. And that's what St. Junipero Serra did. Of course, Pope Francis, being from Argentina, is in one of those parts of what in Europe they call the American continent, we call the Americas, but in one of those areas where the work of evangelization began much sooner, and in a place where there was more sort of cultural infrastructure to work with. And the first evangelizers, Jesuits especially in that part of the continent, succeeded in building up a great new Christian civilization, a real mestizo civilization of blending Christianity with the local culture, sort of baptizing that culture, bringing out the best that is within it. And I still recall the reflection Pope Francis gave us in our very long audience with him on our Ad Limina visit, the visit that bishops do every 5 years to the Holy See. He spent almost 3 hours with us. But he spoke about the idea of mestizo. He said, Our Lady is mestiza because she's her son is divine and human. She's mestiza in her image and in her appearance in Our Lady Guadalupe, rightfully so because of her mestizo son being divine and human. So I think he saw this evangelization of culture carried out in America, and Saint Junipero Serra being a part of that legacy to the point of heroic sacrifice to those who were on the margins and defending them against the abuses of his co-national Spanish soldiers and governors.
So he's a hero to many Californian Catholics and to many Latinos. He represents a willingness to go to the most marginalized people and bring the gospel of Christ. And he also has always been traditionally portrayed as, in his aims, unlike some of the later American governors who sought to deliberately deprive Indians of equality, California Indians of equality, or the Spanish government, which obviously had a great deal of other interests besides the spread of Christianity. The basic impulse of Christianity is the equal dignity of every human soul before God. And Saint Serra to Catholics is an example exactly of these two things that are so relevant right now. One is the problem of establishing real equality, of, as you say in the Washington Post, living up to our creed, which is a very high one and easy to fall from. And the problem of abuse of police powers, because didn't Saint Serra actually continuously fight with the Spanish soldiers to try to protect the Indians, the indigenous peoples? I'm told the California Indians frequently prefer that term, so I'm using them interchangeably. But
yes, people sort of conflate history. There were 3 major periods. There was the mission period that began in San Diego in 1769 with the vision of, again, creating this new Christian civilization. That's why whenever they founded a mission, they founded a school. They were educating the people. They were teaching them agricultural skills, how to grow crops, how to domesticate animals, as well as forming them into faith. The equal dignity you mentioned, the plan was that they would become equal citizens with the Spaniards, equal Spanish citizens with them. And eventually teach them, form them in the faith, teach them self-governance, and then hand the mission territories over to them for their own self-governance. This was the vision. When they first arrived in San Diego, again, being from there, I know it well, the place where they call Presidio Park is a bluff overlooking the bay. And the natural idea was they were going to start everything there. So the Presidio is the soldiers' barracks. So they established that, and they were going to build the mission there and the friary and the school. But they found that Spanish soldiers were abusing the Indians, and especially the women. And there was an uprising in 1774 because the soldiers were abusing and violating the women. And one of the friars was actually killed in that uprising. He went out there to try to calm people down, the soldiers firing guns and the Indians firing arrows, and he took an arrow from one of the Indians. So Serra called him the first martyr of California, Father Luis Jaime. Serra begged for mercy for him and for all the Indians involved in the uprising, but they figured out then they had to move the Indians away from the soldiers. So they moved the mission about 4 or 5 miles inland near the river, close to the source of water, to get them away. And we see that up and down the coast. Wherever there's a presidio attached to a mission, the presidio is miles away from the mission and the school. Now I'm here in San Francisco, and it's the same thing. What we now call Mission Dolores, originally Mission San Francisco de Asís, is in the heart of the city. The presidios at the opening of the bay at the foot of what is now the Golden Gate Bridge. So this is an example of his dedication to protecting the Indians and to seeing them as truly equal and helping them to be equal to the Spaniards who arrived. There were abuses, obviously. The Indians, the Spanish soldiers abused. A lot of the people died because of the diseases that Europeans brought. But the mission system fell apart in 1833, so they did not accomplish the goal. When Mexico took over the missions and secularized them and took the property for themselves, so the whole thing fell apart. Then after the Mexican-American War, it entered into the American era. There was a brief period of the California Republic, and then California became a state in 1850. And that's when the real deliberate violations happened. California actually, they say Serra owned slaves. Serra was a Franciscan. He took a vow of poverty. He didn't own anything. The Franciscans didn't own slaves. The Indians were not slaves under the Spaniards. Okay? They were slaves under the Americans. California legalized the slavery of Indians. And even after California became a state for about 20 years, kept that going. And there was also pretty much of an outright genocide on the Indians. Don't need to qualify it pretty much. So the 49ers came after gold was discovered. Most of them didn't find gold. They decided to settle, go back to their way of farming. So they took the land away from the Indians. They would pass bogus laws where they could steal the land, or they would just kill them. And there was a bounty on Indians. So they would kill an Indian and bring his head in, the Indian's head in, and collect a bounty on it. And the California legislature 3 times funded militias to go and kill Indians, to the tune of about $1.5 million. The first governor of California is quoted here in a book by Benjamin Madley, a professor at UCLA, American Genocide. He quotes the first governor, Peter Hardeman Burnett, as saying, "A war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct." And this continued on for several governors, including Leland Stanford, the founder of Stanford University, the university that formed a committee that decided to strip the name of Serra from the campus. Okay. So people conflate all of that into the Spanish era, the mission era, and pin it all on Father Serra, when all of this is exactly what Father Serra detested. and made heroic sacrifices to oppose.
I was struck in your Washington Post op-ed, you quote a Santa Clara historian who says, and the question of how much responsibility should Father Serra have for what happened afterwards. And he says, we do know what did happen when religious groups were not present to try to protect Native peoples. It was after the collapse of the mission system that the open human rights abuses and deprivation of civil liberties and campaigns of extermination took place. So
Yes.
That's really, Father Moore, I see you there and I see you nodding your head a lot. Did you want to jump in and say a few words about Saint Serra?
Well, Saint Junipero, he's been one of my heroes since I was a kid, just because I love my state and I love California, and I love to evangelize here. I preached on him this morning at St. Dominic's Church on our live stream mass. One thing to add to what the Archbishop was talking about with these wars of extermination, when we, the Dominicans, were established here, we actually had a priest that went out and worked with the indigenous peoples, and he was constantly under death threats from the Americans for basically defending human rights. And so, the Catholic Church definitely was a defender, early on with St. Junipero, and continued on through as a champion of human rights there. It's interesting, I don't think it was till like the late 60s or early 70s that you would even hear different kind of narratives about that, including from the indigenous persons themselves. I'm just grateful I'm hoping that one of the sort of silver linings that can come out of this horrible act that happened last week is that people actually get to know about this great saint.
Mm-hmm.
The Pope said, when he was canonized, the Pope said, one of the great things about is in his homily, Pope Francis said that Saint Junipero Serra recognized the dignity of each and every human person. And because they were human persons, they had the right to hear about the gospel, the saving gospel of Jesus Christ. That the gospel doesn't belong to some sort of club, some sort of elite clique, some sort of group off someplace, but all peoples have this right to hear this. And so it was because he acknowledged their humanity that he acknowledged they also had a right to hear the gospel.
Thank you, Father. I wanted to ask the Archbishop a little bit. The other thing that you did that last time I checked, I think there were 23,000 views on this video, and that was before Matt Drudge posted the video on the Drudge Report. But you went to pray to the site in Golden Gate Park, where the statue of Saint Junipero Serra was toppled. And why did you go, and what did you do there?
Well, it struck me so deeply, and I could see this kind of frenzied mob. I had a real sense of evil. Was not that they were in league with the devil, but somehow evil was present there. Evil was operating, and I think spiritually it left its mark there. I think these are signs of activity of the demonic, and to desecrate a statue of such a holy man and such an act of vandalism and violence. So I thought we did there a deep wound has been cast, and we needed to make reparation for that. So word spread through word of mouth when I told some people I was planning to do this. And I found out it was about 120 people. I didn't count, somebody told me later. So we prayed the rosary, and I prayed the Pope Leo XIII. We know him for the St. Michael prayer. There's actually a more extended form of that prayer, which is a minor exorcism. So I prayed that, and then sprinkled the ground and the pedestal of the statue with holy water.
Father James, you were there, right?
I was. It was a pretty incredible experience for us who were bystanders. I was visibly shaking because it was physically palpable what was happening. But afterwards, a great sense of peace I experienced. Literally, you could feel peace. It's like, the aftermath of that, just the peace came, and it was remarkable for the people there gathered, and for our Dominican fathers and brothers who were there.
Oh, thank you. I'd like to, James, I'm going to in a minute widen the conversation to our audience who can submit questions. There's a Q&A and a chat, so I'm going to do my best to monitor both. And if you raise your hand, I can try to get to you to speak directly, but it's probably a little more reliable to put your questions on the chat or the Q&A. So, but before that, James, I don't know if you wanted to say a few words about the impact of the toppling of Saint Serra on you and of the Archbishop's leadership on this, just from a personal point of view.
Me, James, or Father James?
No, James, Matthew Wilson, sorry.
Yes. Okay. I'm a little bit speechless sitting here. It was a terrible week to watch from afar, from the other side of the country, and I do think so many of us are crying out for both leadership and for public witness to the sanctity of the Church and to the beauty of its history and the beauty of its principles. And so I was very grateful to the Archbishop for what he did this week. And since I don't foresee pleasant days ahead, I'm praying for more witnesses to stand up and to speak the truth of the Church with confidence and bravery. So thank you, Archbishop.
You're welcome.
I just echo, I've had so many people, Archbishop, I probably should bother you with forwarding more of them, but who just want to thank you. People are very hungry for leadership and are very grateful for you in these challenging times. I just asked Michael Beal to unmute himself and promoted you to panelist. If you want to ask a question, let me just, oh, there you are, Michael. If you unmute, there you go. You wanted to ask a question?
Well, no, I think that something got confused. I'm listening right now. I really don't have anything to ask.
Oh, okay.
So sorry.
No worries then. I will go, I have a question, and maybe an unusual question. One, Irene Deem asks, will the statue be repaired and replaced? Do you know, have you heard anything from city officials own that statue, I imagine, city of San Francisco? Where is it now and what's going to happen to it?
The city has it in holding. We're in conversation about acquiring the statue. We found out it was donated back, I believe, in the 1930s. Father James, if you know better, you can correct me. By
1907, I think, is the date.
Oh, yeah, okay, that sounds right. By a group called the Native Sons of the Golden State, which still exists. So we don't know, are they the ones who really have ownership of the statue or not? So we're looking into that. Actually, after this webinar began, I got an email. Looks like there might be some information on that from the title of the email. So I'm kind of anxious to check my emails. But we're trying to enter into negotiations so we can acquire the statue and put it up in an appropriate place here in the Archdiocese.
Well, it would be great to see it protected. Several people wanted to know that. Someone else asks, does anyone know what diocese St. Junipero Serra was assigned to? I'm sure the dioceses were different in 1749 when he set foot in the Americas.
Maybe Father James could answer that better because he's a religious order priest, so he's under a provincial. The provincial is head of a province. So diocesan priests, or what we used to call secular priests, we don't take a vow of poverty, so we can own our own property. We make a promise of obedience to our bishop, and we're under the bishop who's in charge of a geographical territory. Religious who take the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. The priest promises obedience to the bishop and promises celibacy to secular priests. Religious order priests make those three vows. They're under the head of the province, which is a territory of all of the priests of that religious community. Being a Franciscan, then Father Serra was under the provincial of that territory, which I don't know how extensive it was, but I would imagine it probably covered all of what is present-day Mexico and United States. Father James, maybe you could fill in more information.
Yeah, it's a little bit complicated in the governance there, but basically there was no diocese in California at that point. I mean, it was the, I think, the Diocese of Durango first in Mexico, and then later on Sonora. And then I don't think the diocese was here in California until 1840, the Diocese of Ambos Californios, both Alta and Baja California, when it was still Mexico.
Yes.
Pope Gregory the 16th, I think. But Junipero Serra was, his superiors were in Mexico City at the Colegio San Fernando. And what they would do is these colegios, or kind of groupings of friars, were responsible for certain mission territories. And so his brothers were sent, and he was the head of this mission from this Colegio de San Fernando, which you can still see in Mexico City. The church is still there. The rest of it has been destroyed. But his superiors were in Mexico City, the direct superiors.
I have a question here from Adam Arhart. Is there a particular biography of Saint Junipero Serra and the missions of California that you'd recommend? I would just say I just bought one that was published 2 years ago, and it's I should have it, but I don't. It's about making a pilgrimage to all of the missions. So it suggests you can make one online once a day. So it's a really nice. It's not really a history of Junipero, except insofar as it's embedded in the history of all the missions, and he founded 9 of them. But maybe Father James or the Archbishop has a favorite.
Yeah, well, I brought this just in case the question would come up. I think this is probably the most thorough and exhaustive. You can see how thick it is. Junipero Serra, California Indians and the Transformation of a Missionary.
Yeah.
And that's by
co-authored by 2 Santa Clara professors, Rosemary Beebe and Robert Senkovich, who was the one Maggie referred to earlier and quoted in the NCR article.
Yeah, I've known Bob Senkowitz since I was an undergrad at Santa Clara, actually. He was a professor then. I can tell you this, he's no hagiographer, right? He's not just writing this story just to defend a point about St. Junipero Serra. He's a legit historian, and if you want a historical biography, I've read that book cover to cover. I think it's the best thing out there, really. He delves into the sources and tries to get into the mindset of the Spaniards, especially at the end of the 18th century, but also where Saint Junipero comes from, which is actually not even Spain. It's from the islands of Mallorca, and from his philosophical and theological background. So if you want the complete story, that's I would suggest is one of the best ones.
What if you want the best hagiography? You Dominicans, I mean, what if you just want to read a celebration of the saint's life? Any suggestions there?
Well, Dominicans are scholars, remember? So we always,
yes, I know.
Go to the scholarship part. But I would say this, if you want to find something that's contemporary, actually that is very short and gives you kind of a brief overview, Bishop Robert Barron actually created a video a few years ago when Saint Junipero was canonized. And he speaks very briefly about the major points, and he has a very concise way. It's about a 9-minute long video. If you want just a really celebrational video too, I actually made one about 4 years ago when he was canonized. It's about 4 minutes long. So you can find that on our website too. The main hagiography was written by a friend of his named Father Francisco Palu, who's also buried, I believe, at the Carmel Basilica. That is the most extensive hagiographical work of Serra.
By someone who actually knew him. So.
Well, one of his friends for years and years and years. Yeah, one of his best friends.
So from Rachel, we have a question. Archbishop Gomez suggests that the fact that Ventura, which is also having an issue around the statue in front of their city hall of Saint Junipero Serra, which will have a town meeting to dialogue and resolve, including the local indigenous, could possibly be a model for resolving these disputes. Do you have a comment about that?
Dialogue certainly is to be preferred to mob rule, but the dialogue has to be honest. People have to be honestly open to hearing the point of view of the other, And all of the historical facts have to be laid out on the table, and without people becoming overly defensive. And if that happens, it would be very constructive.
So I have a quick comment from Kathleen Moon. I know you know this, Archbishop, but she just wants to point out that Monsignor Francis Weber, the former archivist for the Los Angeles Archdiocese, and who lives at the San Fernando Mission, has written extensively on the California missions. I actually just did order one of his books too, so I'm in rapid learning mode. I have a comment from a question from Peter Carter. So many Catholics are grateful for your public display of leadership following the tearing down of the statue of Saint Junipero, Serra. Have there been repercussions or things you have suffered because of your actions?
No, I can't say that I've suffered any repercussions because of that action.
What is the, we fought shoulder to shoulder a few times, Archbishop.
Yes.
But what has been the reaction that you've
It's been overwhelmingly positive. Again, a request for interviews, and even it piqued the interest of secular media. So the invitation from the Washington Post to write that op-ed, and a local reporter here for the San Francisco Chronicle wanted ask me some questions for an article they were doing. That was probably more with the statement than the rosary and the exorcism prayer, but that nonetheless heightened the visibility. So I haven't received any negative reactions from that.
Well, that's really encouraging. There's a request that I post on chat, the name of the biography, Archbishop, you just recommended. Could you show me that cover again? And then
Yes, I could type it out, but you're going to have to watch my fingers on the screen.
Okay, good.
When I'm through talking, I'll type it out, but this is it. It's
Junipero,
Serra, California Indians and the Transformation of a Missionary.
And it is available on Amazon. Oh, I see somebody just posted the link, so it is available. You don't need to type anything.
Okay, great.
Look, if you're looking for it on the chat, Zoom chat, Levi Baus posted the link to the Amazon story. Patty asks, what steps can the laity take to defend the good names and possibly the public monuments of Saint Junipero, Serra, and other saints under attack?
They first of all need to be well informed about the real history, the history of the church in general, really. There's so much myth about the church's history, and we know the old tirades about and the diatribes about the Crusades and the Inquisition and Pius XII and Nazis and all this, and the actual history is the opposite. Sometimes there are some things that were not all right, and it gets distorted out of proportion, especially if it's put in context of what was going on overall in the society. Other times they're just blatant lies. So people need to be well informed about the history of the church so they can be articulate. And I think they need to organize, writing letters to the editor, meeting with city councils, organize if they're having a meeting to discuss, organize a group to go in there and speak the point of view and to clarify, to speak the real facts. And so you can be articulate, and when you need to defend, you can defend, and then try to use the art of persuasion. So they need to be well-informed and politically and socially involved, as well as, of course, spiritually engaged.
The great Dr. Horst Buchholz mentions that it's not just Saint Serra, that for some people, very oddly, the St. Louis, the good king, in his neck of the woods is coming under attack as well. And this also raises, I believe I've seen stories of Catholics just going to these statues and praying in front of them to be a kind of buffer, a human buffer and a prayer buffer, when mobs form and threaten these statues. You have any
There was
words about
yeah,
that?
there was a YouTube clip of that in the mission Santa Buenaventura in Ventura. College students surrounded it to protect it. But there's a group of men here that are organizing a group for we have another Serra statue south of the city at a rest stop off the Interstate 280. And in fact, I went there this morning to do the same thing, pray the rosary and bless the ground with holy water. But they're trying to organize a week-long sort of vigil where they will pray and observe and make sure nothing happens.
Yeah, I heard it described as a rosary rally. Is that the same group? And by the way, Ben Lima, who we're very happy to have with us, just asked about that, whether there are any threat to the statue standing above Highway 280.
It has been defaced. You know, it's been painted and graffiti and all that, which is why I performed the ritual. Now they cleaned it up. So fortunately, I guess it's under the property of Caltrans, the California Transportation System. So they have cleaned it up. They're intended to.
Archbishop, someone asked, I believe it's Patty, excuse me, that how do they get in touch with that and join that group? Is there some way people who are in the area who want to help pray and protect, how do they connect up?
There a gentleman by the name of Jeff, Geoff Massa, is organizing it. He's kind of scheduling people.
Here's what I would say. If you email me at Maggie1960Gallagher@gmail.com, and you all have my email because you registered to come here or got the link. So just email me if you'd like to join, and I'll track it down and figure out how you connect up with that. So thank you for that. Let's see, I just want to. Gail Quigley asked if you know about the statue at the Capitol building in DC, and that is a statue of saints. Every state gets to put 2 statues of their state's heroes in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda. And St. Serra has, for I don't know how long, maybe you do, Archbishop, been one of the 2 statues representing California in our nation's capital. Are you aware of anything on that?
There's been talk for many years of replacing that statue, and it's intensifying now. But it reminds me of something I wanted to say earlier. It's very appropriate because in addition to being the apostle of California, Father Serra is also the father of California. And what's California is what he started with, kind of laying infrastructure here with farms and pueblos. When he came here to San Francisco, because of his experience in San Diego, he asked the Spanish governing authorities to send soldiers who were married and send them with their wives and their children. And that began the pueblos here. So towns started forming. So California really began under Father Serra. He is the father of the state. So it's very appropriate for him to be there in the rotunda.
So I have a question from Emily.
The new momentum, though, to have it replaced.
Right. So Emily Wilson has a comment and a question. As I said, Emily runs a theater group in New York. There are many who might use the situation with Father Serra, even after being corrected as to his true history, as a starting point to speak of other frustrations with the Catholic Church. And I would just add in, like, the fact that they're going after St. Louis statues. I mean, maybe they're just going after old guys on horses or statues generally, but it seems very peculiar from the narrative. I don't know what his relationship to any of the themes are, right or wrongly. But anyway, Emily goes on to ask, what do you think a pastoral or relational approach to the new evangelization will look like in this new season of even sharper division in the United States? And then she adds, go Cats, Dr. Wilson.
Love that.
I think relational is the key. It has to come out of a relationship, not just a flurry of facts or a flurry of doctrine, but we need to really get to know people. And something we Catholics have always been good at traditionally is trying to understand the other's point of view from the other's point of view, understand how the other thinks, enter into their mind, how do they see the world. I think that's what we have to do when we're relating to people. And so it breaks down stereotypes and helps them maybe to begin rethink. We might not change their mind, but we can change their perspective. Maybe they'll be less hostile and help to see things maybe in a broader perspective. So it does have to come out of a relationship. That's something else Pope Francis is always calling us to, right? A culture of encounter. It has to first come out of a relationship. As someone once said, before people care about what you know, they first have to know that you care.
I have just really a comment from our good friend Roseanne Sullivan, who writes such great things about the Benedict XVI Institute and the traditional Latin Mass and many other things. She says, I chanced to be able to view the cleansing acts by Archbishop Cordileone in Golden Gate Park when I clicked a rosary announcement from Star of the Sea Saturday morning. Thank you, Archbishop. What you did was a brave public witness that helped counteract the spirit of lawlessness that was rampant at the time. I was consoled to witness what you did. Very grateful for your loving defense of wonderful Saint Serra. From my childhood parochial school teachers, I always see him as walking with pain from a leg ulcer along what became the El Camino Real. So I think you made that point in the op-ed too, that among, he walked all the way to Mexico City to try to get the authority to keep on this leg.
Yeah, one of the famous stories about him. First, he walked all the way from Mexico City, first to Baja California, started the mission in Loreto. Then he walked to Alta California, San Diego, then he walked from Carmel, all the way from Carmel, he walked all the way back to Mexico City to get faculties from the Spanish viceroy to discipline the military who were abusing the Indians, all with a painful ulcerated leg.
Wow. John Shipley, go ahead.
I was going to say, Franciscans have a thing about being on horses, and so they're always worried about poverty. So they walked, and he offered that leg ulcer, which came, by the way, when he got to the New World. It was between Veracruz and Mexico City when he was first coming in that he got that ulcer, and it was his cross for the rest of his life. He bore in his body the marks of Christ. I mean,
they had arranged a coach for him to take him from Veracruz to Mexico City. But he wanted to walk instead to show poverty. And then he got bit by an insect in his foot, and that's what gave him pain for the rest of his life.
There's a comment from John Shipley. I almost think this is for Father Moore, but maybe for both of you. During the time Father Serra was beatified, there was a meditation and novena booklet which had a litany at the end for the canonization of then Blessed Serra. This booklet is now out of print. It would be nice to update the litany with a new closing prayer and perhaps reissue this booklet. Copyright is owned by the Franciscan Friars of California, Inc. Gee, if we wanted to do something like that, I wish if we'd had a litany to Saint Junipero Serra, I would have loved to close tonight by chanting it together.
Yeah, no, I remember that. I remember that litany. We didn't. I remember singing it in literature before, leading up to the canonization. I remember that.
Let me just check. I want to be a little mindful of the time, so let me go to just one last comment from Gail Quigley, which leads into, I think, our next section of this program. Gail says, I have lived most of my life on the East Coast in Bethesda, Maryland. My family moved to San Jose for 2 years in my 50s and was introduced to Junipero Serra. I attended the Mass of the Americas at the Shrine in DC, Archbishop Corleone, thank you for making your public statement with the exorcism. And I was very struck in the video that you made about that Archbishop and telling people, how do we respond? You said, of course, first pray to Our Lady, pray the Rosary, live out the consecration in San Francisco to Our Lady that you introduced. And then you also said that we need to continue to offer to our fellow citizens and to the community to offer truth, goodness, and also beauty. That has to be the Christian response. More prayer, more truth, more goodness, and more beauty. Can you tell us a little bit? You also talked in the Washington Post op-ed about the contribution of St. Junipero Serra and the Franciscans to mission architecture. And I know that was a model for you in conceiving of the Mass of the America, which our composer in residence, Frank LaRocca, composed. You talk a little bit about beauty and the integration of
Sure.
culture.
Well, first of all,
into our
truth,
system.
beauty, and goodness are really the most noble part of our human nature, right? If we're made in the image and likeness of God, then we can see these as three attributes of God. So there are three pathways to God, three sort of doors that open up into the encounter with Christ. And the church has been given the world so much of all three. And some people will go through one door, they'll be attracted to that one. Other people will go through another door. There are some people who actually read themselves into the church. They go through the door of truth. They read the fathers of the church. They read their commentaries on scripture, begin to see things in a new way, reflect on Catholic moral teaching, Catholic social teaching. The light goes on, and they come in the church that way. Many people come through the door of goodness. The church is still the largest private provider of social services in so many different ways, from parishes to national and international organizations to Caritas, Catholic Charities, Catholic Relief Services abroad, and so forth. I think the door of beauty is the one that I won't say has been tight shut, closed, but it's just been kind of cracked open a little bit, and we need to open it much wider. Unfortunately, we took a wrong turn with this idea of enculturation. People who are more traditionally minded Catholics, I think, kind of shriek in horror when they hear that word, but it's because it's been misappropriated in the last 50 years. The church has always enculturated. The church has always recognized what's in the society and worked with that to transform it with the truth, beauty, and goodness of the gospel. So the mission church is the image of that. It's a physical sign of how the church enculturates. And as Maggie said, it was my idea for the Mass of the Americas. I asked Frank LaRocca, the composer, to do with sound what the Franciscans did with sight through mission church architecture. It's clearly a traditional Catholic church. It's laid out that way with the altar and everything. But they had to use local building materials, so it's made with adobe. It's not made with brick or stone. And the colors that are used, the whole style of art that evolved around that it blends in with the local culture here. And it's so successful that many secular buildings use that style of architecture to this day because it reflects and expresses the local culture here in the Southwest and in California. So we're trying to open through the Benedict XVI Institute, get that door of beauty much more widely open, because that will bring many more people into the saving encounter with Christ.
Well, that's a good segue to move into our second part of this wonderful evening on the Feast of St. Junipero Serra. I really feel like this is some sort of strange providential God thing, because we had scheduled this event with James Matthew Wilson, knowing that he has written this song cycle called The River of the Immaculate Conception, and it's called The River of the Immaculate Conception. I often ask people, do they know what the River of the Immaculate Conception is? and very few do. I see Father James more smiling. You know what the River of the Immaculate Conception is.
Yeah, keep going though. You're doing
Oh, okay. It's the Mississippi River, and it was consecrated in the 17th century by the Jesuit missionaries who went to the Midwest. And so James Matthew Wilson, when he experienced the Mass of the Americas, when it was first celebrated in the ordinary form in San Francisco in December of 2018 on the Feast of Our Lady of the Immaculate Conception, he was inspired really to start thinking about his childhood vision of America as a Catholic country and what would be like to revive and strengthen that, I guess, as an artist and as a man. So we're going to listen to James Matthew Wilson read 3 poems from this song cycle. Let me hold up the title, The River of the Immaculate Conception.
Yours is disappearing. I'll hold mine up.
Oh, okay. Mine's disappearing? Okay. Sorry, I've got the comments blocking my view. Okay. Oh, wow. It's really not. That's really quite mysterious. Never mind. So you hold up yours and hold it up again, James, while I'm talking. Sorry. And I know that I asked Joshua Wren of Wise Blood Book to send you all a link in case you would like to purchase a copy of this. And I'd like to start by introducing James with a video that Dana Joya did for us about him and about the poem, The River of the Immaculate Conception. So bear with me a minute. I know that sometimes this works better than others. Share computer sound, optimize screen sharing. And how do I get to, here we go. Okay, here we go. So for some reason, the Q&A is just popping up here, blocking what I need to do. Okay, come on, no, you're already going.
Joya, and from the first time that I heard James speak, not knowing anything about him, I recognized him as a really remarkable young intellectual. I think that James Matthew Wilson is the most conspicuously talented young poet critic in American Catholic letters. You know, he brings a kind of phenomenal intellectual preparation to the act, both of writing about poetry and creating poetry. James is also almost unique at the moment of writing in what is the high formal style. When you hear James's work, you know, you're hearing a kind of tradition that's, you know, Anthony Hecht, Robert Lowell, William Butler Yeats. It's the notion of, in a sense, bringing everything into your poetry at a very high level of diction and high level of meditation. And that's exciting to see this tradition, which in some ways was in abeyance, revived in James's work. Certainly this new poem, it's as if James has sat down in this new work with a great organ keyboard, and he's decided he's going to play every key. He's going to pull out every stop in the course of creating this new poem, each of the sections of which is in a different form, a different line length, a different rhyme scheme, a different perspective. And it's incredibly difficult act to bring off, because at every moment you're taking risks. But I think that it is a successful and exciting work. You know, there is at the moment an exciting rebirth of Catholic poetry in the United States, and it's full of talented young writers. But even in this interesting cohort, James Matthew Wilson, I think, is one of the leading people that you are really going to watch in the future.
I just love that little logo thing. I shouldn't have let it go. I'm not wrong. But anyway, we're really very proud. James Matthew Wilson has joined us now as the Benedict XVI Institute's poet in residence. And, whoops. Are you guys all hearing this? No, sorry.
I'm hearing a little something, Maggie.
Yeah, something
That's probably another
I'm
YouTube
going to
video.
exit the full screen, and now how do I get back? Sorry for my technical incompetence here. Escape that screen. Oh my goodness. Are we all? There we are. Okay, good. I was afraid we had lost it. All right, again, apologies. But now let me turn it over to James Matthew Wilson to tell us a little bit about the poems that he's going to read. He's going to start with the hymn of San Juan Diego.
Yes, so when I was invited to write this poem and when I first heard the Mass, there were so many stray threads that I'd been carrying with me for a long time that suddenly converged right at the foot of the altar there that day in San Francisco, almost 2 years ago now. And one of the first things was that Our Lady of Guadalupe, her revelation to Juan Diego was very much not a revelation merely to Juan Diego, but to all of us. And it was a very pointed one. It was hardly a subtle one to the Spanish and to those who had come to the New World, instructing them in how they were, in fact, to view the natives. So when I wrote the hymn of Juan Diego, I wanted it to be a simple ballad. You just saw Dana Gioia there. One of Dana's poems that I really admire is a ballad he wrote about his grandfather who was shot dead in a street in Wyoming in the 19th century. Or not grandfather, excuse me, great-grandfather. So I wanted to do a simple ballad to make it as simple as possible and clear as possible so everyone could understand it. And further, I wanted the poem to follow as closely as possible the original Aztec narrative of Juan Diego's revelation. So I was working with a version of the Aztec text, and I did make some changes, which I'll maybe talk in the question and answer if you like about some of those. But let's hear the poem. So this is part 2 of 7 of the River of the Immaculate Conception, the hymn of Juan Diego. Thus it is said that Juan Diego saw first the Aztec girl, her shoulders cloaked in starry mantle, her hair dark as the merle. The hill whereon she stood had been an ancient mother's home, laid low with all Tenochtitlan when stout Cortez had come. Light sprang from dull rocks at her feet, and birdsong filled the place, while she herself eclipsed the sun, its blaze about her face. And every color of the stones for which the Spaniards killed became the turquoise and the gold with which the sky was filled. All those who seek me, little one, will have me for their mother, and those by pride or greed estranged will someday call you brother. Juan begged the bishop, build a church, received a doubtful smile, and felt his own unworthy bones as ignorant and vile. The bishop's jeweled servants scorned him, said he was telling lies. A second time the bishops asked, a second time denies. Some thought to beat Juan for his words. He found his uncle ill, so every claim upon him held led him to avoid her will. But she met him upon the way. Why do you run from me? My mantle covers you already and sets your uncle free. Gather these roses in your cloak, as your land's never seen. Then lay them at the holy feet, and he'll know what they mean. The brute crowd at the bishop's door stood in his way and sneered. They saw his breast of flowers and snatched. The petals disappeared. So Juan Diego was let in to stand before the throne, to show his harvest of the rose where rose had never grown. I've done as she, the mother of God, told me to do, he said, and poured out at the bishop's feet the bright, abundant red. But as these fell, the bishop saw Juan's rough-stitched cloak unfold, the image of that placid queen ablaze with teal and gold. He fell upon his knees in praise and wept for love of her, who on that land of rock and thorn her great care should confer. Beneath her mantle and her banner, all those vast lands are warmed, but what we seek in them must be first by her love transformed. And so Diego's cloak poured forth not conquest, but sweet flowers, and Mary chose a tattered cloth to first unveil her powers.
Wow.
It just has struck me that the colors of the minerals after which the Spaniards, explorers first came in search of gold, that for Europeans to discover what they had really been brought here for, that desire had to be transformed. The blood of the Indians had to be transformed into the red of the roses of Our Lady of Guadalupe, and the minerals that the precious metals they were seeking had to be transformed into the colors and the gems that anoint her. But of course, it was a long process, in a manner of speaking, of conversion. Among the statues that have been attacked these last few weeks has been the statue of Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus, as too few people seem to know, was sent home in chains because very early on, the priests and missionaries who came to the Americas saw the abuses that were taking place and sought to correct them and to stop them, and campaigned very hard to stop them. So the process of conversion, though it began very early, in one sense was gradual. And so the third poem from the River of the Immaculate Conception is called The Presentation of the Gifts. It takes place during the presentation of the gifts of the Mass, and it begins with the opening sentences describe something that won't be obvious to someone hearing it for the first time, but something that Maggie and the Archbishop will have seen at first hand, which was the great pilgrimage across San Francisco on the feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe that so many Californians made, which arrived at the cathedral just before the beginning of the Mass of the Americas, and which was completed on knees. Here I was sitting, I think, the third pew in, and I turned to my left, and there were pilgrims on their knees processing to the altar, and they continued until they arrived at the great image of Our Lady just to the right of the sacristy. And so that's where this poem begins. It concludes, however, very personally. Those of you who know Tucson may know the mission of San Xavier del Bac, which is the northernmost mission of New Spain. So it's before the missions of Saint Serra begin, which are the American missions. And when I visited that church many years ago, when my oldest daughter Livia was 6 months, in fact, to the day, I had just received in the mail actually a poem from Dana Joya, which he had just written, called "The Angel with the Broken Wing," which is a beautiful poem spoken by a santo in a church. And so then I went into this mission church and was looking at the santos and praying and thinking about the strange crucifix that's been formed by this country, of the Spaniards bringing Christianity north by way of Mexico, and the pioneers coming from the east out west in search of gold. And there's a poignant and somewhat painful message in that crucifix as in every crucifix that requires our thought and meditation. So this poem tries to explore some of that, specifically in terms of the Spanish who first came to the Americas. Part 3, the presentation of the gifts. What did they come for? Those on bended knees who scrape their weight along the temple stone. What did they come for? Those retired in pews with faces elevated toward the cross. The crawling ceases in a posture of prayer, heads bowed before a woman clothed in sunlight, and silence covers everyone with waiting between the moment when the word is spoken and that one still to follow, when the word will with the muttered word become our bread. They came first with a gaze of jewel-eyed wonder to find so rich a land, and one that grew with every legend of a golden city. De Vaca came for conquest, one hidalgo in search of honor lost in time, but found himself a naked pilgrim, marched in chains, a blistered holy man who signed the cross to drive the devil from the Indian's wounds. At last, a chaste colonial, dismayed as those he'd known, rode north to sate their lusts. We know Fray Cancer came to preach, though all his crew refused to land the boat, but watched as his white habit struggled through the waves, emerged, then bowed to pray upon the sand. Armed Indians watched as well, no less in awe, then dragged him to a grassy hummock, where they beat him with their clubs till he was dead. And in the little grotto where Rose prayed, shorn of her glory, fasting, crowned with iron, she suffered for the Christ and for this land. Her friend, the bastard of a slave, the humble sweeper of floors, de Porras took the leper, the Indian stabbed and bleeding in the street, and bathed their wounds and gave them his own bed, until it seemed the cat, dog, bird, and mouse would sit at the same dish of milk and dine. And Serra, bitten on the royal path, would limp his passion's way to California, extending with each step the Spanish Empire, but planting too a vineyard for the Lord. Why did we pass beneath the pilgrim's shell to step inside the mission of San Xavier? That day, my wife and little girl and I. We stared up at the spread of florid columns, the drapery of stone about the santos, their plaster faces stilled in holiness and lean forms gowned in gaudy iridescence. The northern march of missions halted here, exhausted, foiled, but sure they'd come, not chasing gold cities, but to build of prayer and clay. The fourth part of the poem is a long narrative poem that recounts the adventure of Father Marquette as he set out with Joliet to discover the Mississippi. And that had to be at the heart of the poem for a few reasons. The French came later to North America than the Spanish did. And in one sense, at least, their adventure here was marked more explicitly by an unequivocal sense of holiness and spreading the grace of God across a new continent. And that was a great blessing for me, who, as a child, growing up in Michigan, was taught a history of my state, of Michigan, in my Catholic school, where the true heroes of American history were the French missionaries who slipped along the rivers in their canoes and spread the gospel to the Indians. As I mentioned in an article in First Things earlier this year, so convincing was my great teacher, Mrs. Rambo, about these things, that we even sided with the French in the French and Indian War against the English. The English, the American colonists were just Protestants. We had to side with this Catholic people that had come to spread the gospel. Maggie?
I don't want to interrupt you but I thought, first of all, I would like to pause a little bit. We're getting a lot of praise, and I don't know how often poets get praised for their work, but I remember after the Mass of the Americas, And I was just getting all of these accolades for Frank LaRocca's composition, and I sent them a bunch of them, and then I was like, you know, are you getting tired of me sending you all of this praise? And he's like, it doesn't happen that often. So he was a little sheepish, but so, you know, Adam Cariarty, who is a psychiatrist at the University of California at Irvine, just says, terrific. We have, sorry, people are typing things, so it starts moving as I'm trying to read. Adam Arhart, who does evangelization with St. Charles Borromeo in DC, says, very beautiful indeed. And I think he's speaking in particular about the hymn of San Juan Diego. It made me think of one of the intercessions of the morning prayer on the feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe. By the presence of Mary, you made the desert bloom with flowers. May the Blessed Virgin Mary's love transform us into the image of Christ. James, did that? What do you?
Yeah, that image is actually in the original Aztec account of the apparition. It couldn't be more steeped in the history of the revelation, and it's such a, as I said, it's not a subtle revelation. Our Lady knew what needed to be said to her people, and I just pray that we someday learn to listen.
Archbishop, I remember your homily at the Mass of the Americas, and the statement that I will do this for no other people.
Yes, Psalm 147.
Yeah.
I like it in Latin, Father James. The sound of Latin. Non fecit talitarum ni natione. Have not done thus for any other nation. So it's the Psalm 147 speaking about the ancient people of Israel. To no other nation has God revealed himself, has God given this higher law, this revelation. And that was what Pope Benedict XIV exclaimed when he was presented with an image of Our Lady and it explained about the miracle, the apparition. He quoted that psalm because nowhere has Our Lady so presented herself with the image of herself, incarnated with the people, and brought such a massive wave of conversion.
I also like the way you wove the Dominicans into that poem. That was fantastic.
Yeah.
That was great. That was fantastic. Thank you.
I'm praying, Father, that your last Mass not end the way Fray Conceres did. Speaking of that poem, actually, the first important work of American literature is the chronicle of the Narvaez expedition, which I talked about there when I talked about de Vaca, Cabeza de Vaca, who came a Hidalgo, a knight, to conquer the Americas. And he landed by misadventure on the Gulf Coast of Florida, and for years traveled with a handful of friends, during which he was enslaved. I describe it all in the poem in a very condensed manner, and this long pilgrimage afoot, which eventually brought him around the Gulf Coast back into Mexico, was truly a pilgrimage of conversion for him, so that he had become, over the course of this journey, a great holy man who healed the Indians as he was marching, sometimes as a slave on a forced march, sometimes as a free man, and eventually did make it back to Mexico City, a transformed man, one no longer seeking the external glories of the world, but only the beauty of holiness. This really should be one of the foundational texts. The account of his journey should be one of the foundational texts of every American education, and certainly in every Catholic school.
Well, we're coming up on our nation's birthday, so this is also, just in a few days. And it was when I was really listening to you at the conference in November after the first celebration of the Mass of the Americas in the extraordinary form, which anyone who was there will never forget. And it was an extraordinary conference afterwards either. And I wandered into your breakout session and heard you say this idea of America as a Catholic country, right? And of course, it doesn't mean America is only a Catholic country, and it doesn't mean that the great founding narrative of what was happening on the East Coast, that, you know, the dominant narrative of America's founding, which is being challenged in various ways, that is not a true story and the great true story. But there is this other founding of America that was happening around the same time in different places. I don't know, maybe, do you want to tell us a little bit about
Absolutely. So let me say a word about that, and then maybe I should actually read the poem about it. So one of my great
But by the way,
heroes.
I want to finish the last thing I want to happen at this is for you to read that poem, and we'll say goodnight. So that's why I'm stopping you before you read it now, because I think that will be our ending note.
Oh, very good. So I'll just say a word or two then of what you're saying. And this will be clear in the first stanza of the poem when I read it. One of my great heroes is Robert Frost, whose great poem, The Gift Outright, is a reading of America. And Frost was a great patriot. Christopher Reeve, the actor who played Superman, his father, whom I met in his last years, was a Robert Frost scholar and actually traveled with Robert Frost to the Soviet Union in the early 1950s. And he said to me that Frost truly believed, as do many of us, that America was the future of the world, that it was a gift to the world. But part of what Frost meant by that was its Yankee do-for-yourself independence that has its sort of intellectual roots in John Locke, a philosopher that no Catholic can be entirely sympathetic with, if for no other reason that he approved of religious tolerance for everyone except Catholics. But Locke's vision of what it meant to own a land or any property was to mix your labor, as it were, with the dust. That once you've added your labor to the raw material of nature, it's yours by right. And Frost was sort of a latter-day Locke in that respect. And there's much to be said and admired about it. And when I think of how many people died crossing the Atlantic to come to this country, I stand in awe of their courage. So many expeditions to the United States, to what's now the United States, ended in heartbreak and death and extinction. But that great story of a pioneering spirit of, as it were, conquest, though part of our history, is neither the fullness of our history, nor, since it's a merely human story, could it ever be the deepest and most profound part of our story. And so as the River of the Immaculate Conception continues, I seek to add that Catholic dimension to our history, which is really saying not only Catholic in the ecclesial sense of it, but in the sense of people coming to this country and discovering through their encounter with this new land what it is that God is really calling us all to. And that is the case for every one of us, is an act of conversion and self-surrender and reliance on him.
It was wonderful. I want to respect the time of the Archbishop and our participants. And so I'd just like to thank everyone for coming. I also want to put in a plug for CatholicArtsToday.com, our literary, it's not a literary magazine, it's our online magazine dedicated primarily to the work and the life of living Catholic artists. And James' poetry is published there if you just want to go and read it immediately at CatholicArtsToday.com. And I'd like to end with the reading of this poem that James has been discussing, the Gloriosa. But before that, I'd like to ask Archbishop Cordileone if he would give us his blessing.
Certainly. The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord let his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord look upon you kindly and grant you his peace, the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Amen.
James, take us out.
So this is part 5, Gloriosa Dicta Sunt Dite. When we think of our land, we often think of those bare wilds waiting to be claimed, as if it were a force of will alone that made it ours, and mixing sweat with dust, its matter with our labor. What was nothing becomes somehow a thing that might be loved, be built upon and put to use, defended. I have been one of those who stand in awe of pioneers and makers of great things, of those who slice a sharp spade through thick roots. How much less often do we think of land not as the stuff lain idle to be grabbed, but as a stage, a platform, where we stand, not empty, for upon it we depend, not arbitrary, for it's all been formed so long before our dawning that we sense 100 histories have gone to dust, deepening the hillsides, carving out its rivers. How rarely do we think of it as place, as scene where destinies are shaped by grace. So, in my childhood, the lakeside chapel, modest and plain, shaped like a wooden boat, where I heard mass in summertime, was named for Saint de Porres, and he prayed for us, though all I knew about him was his name. And so, in Maryland and San Francisco, the place is named not for what we have done there, but for what we hope we might still receive, the walls of every city, home, and church designed just to contain what grace will fill them with. So, sitting in my classroom as a boy, the school named for St. Thomas of Aquino, I heard my teacher speak of Michigan, of Joliet, Doblin, and Père Marquette. And telling us their stories, she unfolded another history than the one we're used to, one in which, by the Holy Spirit's grace, men slipped along the wilderness's veins, bearing such names as hitherto unspoken might be, to consecrate a land of saints. For naming is a kind of grace, not deed. It clarifies what was not understood, such that what outwardly remains the same becomes itself more fully and more truly, transformed within by the articulate light. To lay above a saint's bones on the shore, to pray the words that saints have prayed before, to name and know what comes forth from the darkness. These are the occupations of a place, its purpose and its glory and its grace.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Archbishop. Thank you, Father. And thanks to all of you for being part of this tonight. Our next event is July 11th, which is the feast of Saint Benedict, the patron saint of Europe, the founder of Western monasticism, and of course the namesake of our beloved Pope Benedict XVI. That's probably got the direction wrong. But at any rate, Pope Benedict took his name when he became Pope. So we hope to see you. Will be getting an email about this, and we hope to see you again. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.